relaxing in a floating hot tub off a luxury yacht. The warm water suddenly became ice cold, looking down to see a massive shape passing beneath. Before a warning could be shouted, the tub flipped, plunged into the ocean, surrounded by curious orcas. Their playfulness quickly turned to something more sinister. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we begin the orca attack story, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe, click the like button, and leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. Now let's move on to the case. Tom Larson steered his sailboat through the narrow fjords of Alaska, the boat's bow slicing through the chilled water as the morning mist clung to the jagged cliffs that rose steeply on either side. The sun had barely crested the horizon, casting a faint golden light across the rugged coastline. For a seasoned sailor like Tom, these waters were both familiar and humbling, a place of quiet beauty and unforgiving nature. It had been years since he'd sailed these same channels, and the sense of peace he found here always brought a deep satisfaction. As he navigated the tight turns of the fjord, the boat's sails billowed in the wind, catching the breeze and pushing the vessel steadily forward. The sea was calm, with no sign of the storm clouds that had threatened the night before. It was one of those rare, perfect mornings when the ocean was a sheet of glass, reflecting the towering walls of rock on either side. Tom felt a deep connection to the water, the steady rhythm of the boat beneath his feet a reminder of all the years he'd spent on the sea. This was his element. He took a deep breath, the cool air filling his lungs. There was something about the fjords that always put him at ease. Perhaps it was the remoteness of the place or the isolation that came with it. Few ventured here. It was a sailor's sanctuary, a place where you could feel truly alone, at least until you made your way back to the bustling docks. But here now it felt like he was in the company of something far older, something that had seen generations of sailors come and go. Tom glanced over the edge of the boat, his eyes scanning the water below. It was early enough that the waters were still, and he could see the dark shadows of fish darting below the surface. He wasn't expecting much on this trip. It was just a routine sail, a way to clear his mind. As a fisherman and a sailor, he'd seen it all: the peaceful swells of the Pacific, the violent storms of the Bering Sea. But it was in places like this, these quiet, untouched corners of the world, that Tom truly found peace. Then something caught his eye. A dorsal fin sliced through the water, sharp and dark against the light blue surface. It was low, almost hidden beneath the water, but Tom could make it out with ease. His heart skipped a beat, and his first instinct was to dismiss it as a seal or some other marine creature. But as he squinted into the distance, he saw it again. Another fin, then another. The unmistakable shape of orcas. His pulse quickened. These waters weren't exactly known for frequent orca sightings, but they were not unheard of. The pods were rare in this part of the coastline, but Tom had heard the stories from the locals of pods passing through, migrating along the fjords, sometimes following the salmon runs that made their way up the rivers. Still, even the most seasoned sailors spoke of the orcas in hushed tones, as if these creatures held a power that none of them could quite explain. "Never get too close, Tom," one of the old fishermen had warned him once years ago. "They're smart, and they don't take kindly to trespassers. Keep your distance, you don't want to get in their way." Tom was about to turn the boat slightly to avoid getting too close when he noticed something odd. The orcas weren't moving away. In fact, they seemed to be coming closer. His grip tightened on the wheel. They were beautiful creatures, graceful and powerful. But there was an unsettling energy in the air now. The way they moved, circling the boat slowly, unnerved him. He had seen whales in the wild before, humpbacks, gray whales, even a few minke whales. But orcas were different. They were hunters, top predators in the ocean. He slowed the boat slightly, trying to assess the situation. The pod, a group of 6 or 7 animals, was now completely surrounding him. They moved in tandem, their black and white bodies visible as they broke the surface, their dorsal fins cutting through the water like silent sentinels. Their movements were so fluid, so deliberate. Tom couldn't help but feel the weight of their presence. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered to himself, leaning forward slightly to get a better view. He had no intention of getting too close. He knew better than that. The last thing he needed was to get caught in the middle of a pod that was feeling territorial or playful. The stories he'd heard about orca behavior were often contradictory. Some said they were curious, others claimed they could become aggressive without warning. Either way, he wasn't about to risk it. "Just keep your distance," he whispered under his breath, trying to convince himself more than anything else. The orcas seemed to be examining the boat, their sleek bodies gliding through the water with practiced ease. For a moment, Tom allowed himself to relax. They weren't attacking and they weren't behaving aggressively. This was just a passing encounter. He had seen whales up close before, and it was always a breathtaking experience. Then, without warning, the pod split. The largest orca in the group, Tom could make out its size even from a distance, moved toward the boat. Its body cut through the water with speed and power, a blur of black and white beneath the surface. The others followed closely, but it was the lead orca that captured Tom's attention. It was moving faster now, its dorsal fin cutting through the water with a sharp cutting motion. Before Tom could react, the orca breached. It erupted from the water with a powerful thrust, its massive body twisting as it launched itself upward. Tom stumbled backward, barely managing to keep his balance on the deck. The boat rocked violently from the force of the breach, and he heard the distinct crack of the hull straining under the weight of the impact. "What the hell?" he shouted, his voice rising in panic. The orca landed back in the water with a tremendous splash, sending waves crashing against the sides of the boat. Tom's heart raced as he scrambled to regain control. The orca's massive body had been mere feet from him, its jaws snapping open and closed as it disappeared back beneath the surface. It was then that the boat lurched. Tom's stomach dropped as the hull groaned under the sudden pressure. He turned to see another orca, this one even larger, swimming swiftly toward the boat. Before he could react, it slammed into the side, sending a shudder of terror through the boat's frame. Water splashed up, drenching Tom as the orca struck again, this time harder. Tom staggered, barely keeping his footing as the boat tilted dangerously to one side. He gripped the wheel, trying to steady the vessel, but the orca hit again, this time with such force that Tom was thrown to the deck. He groaned in pain as he scrambled to get back on his feet, heart pounding in his chest. "Shit, shit, shit," he cursed, scrambling for the emergency kit. His hand shook uncontrollably as he pulled out the flare gun, not sure what good it would do but desperate to send some kind of signal. The orca surfaced once more, this time directly beside the boat. It was impossibly close, its black eye staring at Tom with an eerie intelligence. He felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The creature was toying with him, and he knew it. A third strike. This time the boat began to tilt in earnest, water rushing in through the cracks in the hull. Tom's breath quickened, his mind racing. He had to get out of here, but the boat was sinking fast. There was no time to waste. He grabbed the emergency raft, struggling to untangle the ropes as the boat continued to tilt. The orcas circled, their bodies rising and falling like dark shadows beneath the water. Tom could hear their haunting calls, distant clicks and whistles that echoed through the fjords, like a warning. With one last frantic effort, Tom managed to push the raft into the water. The boat groaned again, and in that moment he felt the full weight of the ocean beneath him. His hands were shaking as he climbed into the raft, the cold water soaking through his clothes. The orcas circled again, their eyes never leaving him. Tom paddled furiously, trying to put as much distance between himself and the sinking boat. He didn't dare look back. The orcas had made their move, and there was no turning back now. The pod, a perfect picture of nature's terrifying power, vanished beneath the water as quickly as it had appeared. Tom glanced over his shoulder, the fjord stretching out before him, empty now except for the faint ripples of the water. The orcas were gone, but the terror, the fear of what he had just experienced, would remain forever. The air had shifted in the fjord, and Tom Larsen felt it deep in his bones. The quiet stillness that had greeted him in the early morning now seemed oppressive. He had been surrounded by the orcas for what felt like hours, but in reality it had only been minutes. Their fins sliced through the water with unnerving precision, their movements synchronized as if they were performing a silent, ominous ballet. Tom's boat floated motionless, the sails slack against the mast. The wind had died down, leaving only the sound of the gentle lapping of water against the hull. It was supposed to be a peaceful morning, a solitary journey through these remote Alaskan fjords. Instead, he found himself trapped in a staring contest with the ocean's most powerful predator. "All right, take it easy," Tom muttered to himself, trying to steady his breathing. He had sailed these waters for years, but this was different. The orcas weren't acting like a curious pod passing through. They were calculating, almost too deliberate in their movements. His eyes darted from one orca to another. The sleek black and white bodies were everywhere, slipping in and out of the water like shadows. He could hear their soft calls, low clicks and whistles that echoed through the fog-heavy air. It wasn't just a sound. It was an intelligence, a communication that made his skin crawl. The fact that they were this close, surrounding him, made it clear they weren't just passing by. Tom couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He had been around whales before, seen humpbacks breach, spotted gray whales from a distance. But orcas, he had never been so close. Not to a pod this size, not to such aggressive behavior. He turned the wheel slightly, trying to put some distance between the boat and the orcas. But they adjusted, always staying within his peripheral vision. One orca, the largest of the group, broke away from the others and swam directly toward the boat. Tom stiffened as the animal moved effortlessly through the water, cutting the surface with its sharp dorsal fin. "Easy, big guy," Tom said under his breath, a nervous laugh escaping his lips. "I'm just passing through." But the orca didn't seem to care. Its eyes, black and unreadable, locked onto him as it swam closer, its body gliding just beneath the surface. Tom could feel the tension in the water, the way it seemed to change as the orca neared. The weight of the predator's gaze was unmistakable. Tom instinctively shifted the wheel again, hoping to push the boat away from the looming animal. But as he did, the orca made a sharp turn, mirroring his movement with unnatural precision. It wasn't following him. It was anticipating his every move. The boat lurched suddenly, rocking violently to one side as the orca struck. Tom's heart leaped into his throat, and he lost his grip on the wheel for a split second, his body thrown to the deck with a force that left him breathless. "What the hell?" he grunted, scrambling to his knees. Another orca surfaced, this one smaller but just as determined, its tail slamming against the side of the boat. The hull groaned under the impact, the sound of cracking wood ringing out like thunder. Water began to flood in through the cracks, and the boat tilted even further to one side. Tom's mind raced, his instincts kicking into overdrive. He staggered to his feet, eyes scanning the deck as he reached for the emergency flare gun stashed under the seat. His hands trembled as he yanked it free. Come on," he muttered, his voice thick with panic. He knew the orcas weren't here for the flare, and he knew they didn't care about the boat. They were predators, precision hunters, not like the dolphins or humpback whales he'd seen before. He had no idea why they were behaving like this, but he couldn't wait around to find out. The large orca that had been circling the boat moved again, cutting through the water like a missile, its black and white body breaking the surface just long enough for Tom to glimpse its massive size. It was close now. Too close. Tom's breath caught in his throat as the orca charged. Instinctively, he threw the flare gun into the air, watching as it arced toward the sky. The loud pop of the flare sounded deafening in the still air, but it did nothing to deter the orca. It had no interest in the flare. It was focused entirely on the boat. The attack was swift. The orca struck with such force that Tom was thrown to the deck again, this time losing his grip on the flare gun as the boat tilted sharply. He heard the crack of the mast as it splintered, and a cold surge of water rushed over him, soaking him to the bone. "Shit!" Tom shouted, scrambling to his feet. The orca did not relent. It was focused, predatory. Tom could hear its massive tail slapping against the water, each strike a warning, each strike a reminder of how little control he had in this situation. He scrambled for the emergency raft, his hands fumbling as the boat continued to tip. Raft was locked in a compartment, and he had to fight the panic rising in his chest as he tried to pull it free. The boat rocked again, sending him sliding across the deck, and the world seemed to spin as another wave of water hit the boat's side. "You've got to be kidding me," he gasped, his fingers finally grabbing hold of the release rope. With one final desperate tug, the raft came free. He threw it into the water, the sound of the orca's low whistle echoing in his ears. But just as he reached for the raft, another orca charged, its massive body surging from below. Tom didn't even have time to react as the creature slammed into the boat once more. This time the hull cracked deeply, the boat groaning as it began to list further. Water poured in, swallowing the deck. He could hear the orcas now, clicking and calling to each other, their sounds growing more urgent, more focused. The pod was closing in. The largest of the orcas was circling once more, its black and white body moving with eerie precision. Tom didn't have time to waste. The raft was the only chance he had. He dove into the water, his clothes heavy with seawater, but he couldn't afford to wait. The raft was his only hope. He kicked his legs, pushing himself forward, his mind fogged with panic. The sound of orcas' tails slapping against the water was deafening now, and their sharp fins were slicing through the surface around him. His heart pounded in his chest as he fought the current, struggling to stay afloat. A wave crashed over him, and for a brief moment, he lost his bearings. When he resurfaced, gasping for air, he saw the raft ahead of him bobbing on the waves. He reached for it, dragging himself up, his limbs shaking from exhaustion and terror. The orcas were still there, circling. Tom could feel their presence, feel their intelligence, their calculating nature. They were not just creatures of instinct, they were predators, and he was their prey. Tom clung to the raft, trembling as he looked back at the sinking boat. The orcas had already begun to disperse, disappearing into the depths as quickly as they had come. Tom barely had time to process what had just happened. He could only stare at the water, listening to the last whispers of their calls fading into the distance. For a moment, everything was still. The fjord, once filled with the sound of orcas and crashing waves, was now silent. Tom's pulse slowly began to steady as he lay back against the raft. His body ached. His head was spinning, but he was alive. Barely. The terror of the attack still clung to him, a visceral reminder of how close he had come to death. He wiped seawater from his eyes and turned his gaze back to the empty waters. The orcas were gone. But Tom knew one thing for sure. They hadn't left because they were done. They had left because they had no need to finish the job. They were in control here, and they had proven it beyond a shadow of a doubt. Tom's heart hammered in his chest as the raft bobbed violently in the water, every creak of the wood echoing through the dense silence that now surrounded him. He had barely managed to drag himself into the raft when the last thunderous strike from the orcas had shattered the boat. The mast had fallen into the sea and the hull had split, sinking lower with each passing moment. His once sturdy vessel was now a sinking wreck, its fate sealed by the brutal power of the ocean's top predator. His breathing was shallow, gasping for air as he tried to steady himself, but the waves and the raft's constant rocking made it difficult to focus. His limbs were sore, cold, and stiff, and he could still taste the salt water that had filled his throat after he'd briefly gone under. His hands trembled as he reached for the emergency radio, his fingers slick with seawater. The small device barely fit in his grip, but he had to make contact with the outside world. He had to. He wasn't sure he could survive much longer out here on his own. "Come on," he muttered under his breath, pressing the distress signal button repeatedly. His mind raced. There was no telling how far he was from shore, no way of knowing how long it would take for someone to reach him. The silence that followed was deafening. No response. His stomach churned with dread. He glanced over the side of the raft, eyes scanning the water. The fjord stretched endlessly in every direction, a cold, gray void. The orcas were gone, but Tom knew better than to feel safe. The eerie clicking and whistling calls of the pod still echoed in his mind, a constant reminder that the terror was far from over. He could still hear the slaps of their tails and the powerful thrumming of their bodies as they charged. The memories of those moments surged up, vivid and violent. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise, a splash. The water churned in front of him. His heart leaped into his throat as he whipped his head toward the disturbance. The sharp, black fin of an orca broke the surface, slicing through the water with terrifying grace. Tom's stomach twisted and his instincts screamed at him to paddle, to move, but he knew he couldn't outrun it. He couldn't escape them. Not in this tiny raft. The orca circled. It was smaller than the others, perhaps an adolescent or a younger member of the pod. Its movements were fast and fluid, the body carving through the water like a shark stalking its prey. Tom could see the familiar black and white pattern of its body just beneath the surface as it came closer. "No, no, please," Tom whispered, hoarsely. He didn't know if the orca could hear him or if it cared, but he wasn't sure what to do. The raft offered little protection, and the orca was too fast, too unpredictable. He remembered the way it had attacked the boat, striking with precision, breaking apart the hull as if it was nothing more than a toy. He could feel his chest tighten as the creature glided closer, its large eyes never leaving him. He pulled the small oar from the raft's side, his hands shaking violently as he attempted to paddle away. It was futile. The orca was moving far too quickly. With each stroke, the raft seemed to float slower, drifting toward the dark shapes beneath the water, shadows moving with an unsettling rhythm. He could almost feel the pressure of the predator's gaze on him. The orca breached. It was fast, its enormous body exploding out of the water in a spray of salt and mist. Tom barely had time to react before the animal was upon him. The raft rocked violently, throwing him off balance as the orca slapped its tail against the water with a deafening crash. Tom's stomach lurched with terror as the raft was tossed aside like a toy, the wood creaking and groaning under the pressure. "God damn it," Tom shouted, panic clawing at his chest as he scrambled to grab the raft, his fingers slipping against the wet surface. The orca came again, its dorsal fin slicing through the water just feet from him. It was too close now. Too close to escape. Tom's heart was racing, his breath caught in his throat as he clung to the raft, every muscle in his body screaming for him to swim to safety. But there was no safe place here. The water was their domain. Suddenly, the sound of another orca, larger than the first, erupted from the depths. A loud, powerful slap of its tail shook the water beneath him, sending waves crashing into the raft. Tom was thrown back, his chest slamming hard against the edge. He gasped for air, his body numb from the cold. But the fear was all-consuming. His hands were raw as he fought to hold on to the raft, but it seemed to be slipping away from him, carried by the relentless waves. He didn't dare look around. He couldn't let himself. Every part of his mind screamed at him to move, but there was nowhere to go. The water was swallowing him, and the orcas were closing in. A piercing, high-pitched whistle split the air. Tom looked up just in time to see the largest of the pod breach, its massive body leaping from the water with a speed that made his stomach drop. It crashed back into the water with a thunderous splash, sending waves that rocked the raft violently. The force of the attack was enough to rip the raft away from his grip, leaving him stranded in the open water. His hands shot out, desperately trying to grab onto something, anything. He managed to catch hold of a loose rope, the thin line digging into his palms as the raft was dragged further into the abyss. He kicked his legs furiously, trying to propel himself toward the raft again, but his body felt like lead, each movement a painful reminder of how close he was to being consumed by the vast empty ocean. The orcas had disappeared for a moment, but the silence only amplified his fear. He couldn't see them now, but he knew they were still there, watching, waiting. He could feel the weight of their presence as they circled just beneath the surface, their black and white forms rising and falling with unnatural precision. They were playing with him, toying with him. He was nothing but a helpless, floundering creature to them. The sound of the water changed. He could hear it, low, guttural, like a rumble of thunder beneath the surface. Tom's breath caught in his throat as a shadow moved underneath him, the water swirling violently. His heart skipped a beat, and before he could react, the orca lunged from below, its open mouth rushing toward him. Tom screamed, throwing his arms up in a frantic attempt to shield himself. But the orca didn't strike. Instead, it broke through the surface again, its massive body propelling itself with terrifying speed just inches from his face. Tom froze, his body rigid with fear as he locked eyes with the predator. There was no mistaking the intelligence in those black eyes. This was no accident. The orca had him in its sights. It was deliberate. "Stay away." Tom breathed, his voice barely more than a whisper as he gripped the raft with all the strength he had left. He was exhausted, his limbs weak, his mind clouded by the constant surge of adrenaline. The orca circled again, and this time it was joined by two more, their dorsal fins cutting through the water like sleek blades. Tom's pulse quickened as the realization hit him. They were surrounding him. He could hear the low clicks of their sonar, almost like a whisper in the water. It was as if they were communicating, discussing what to do with their prey. Tom's stomach twisted, and a chill ran down his spine. He had to get away. But how? The raft would never protect him. The orcas were too powerful. The largest orca surged forward again, but this time it didn't strike the raft. Instead, it swam underneath it, its massive body creating a wake that nearly capsized Tom. He grabbed the edge of the raft, his knuckles white, the sound of his own pulse pounding in his ears. With a final, deliberate slap of its tail, the orca disappeared into the depths. Tom was left gasping in the silence that followed, his body trembling with shock and exhaustion. The pod had retreated, but for how long? Tom had no idea. All he knew was that the terror wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He sat in the raft, motionless, eyes scanning the water for any sign of movement. He had survived the first attack, but he knew the orcas were not done with him yet. The waiting game had begun. Tom clung to the raft, his arms burning from the effort of holding on, his legs numb from the cold. The orcas were gone now, or at least out of sight. The water had grown eerily calm, the surface flat and unbroken except for the occasional ripple of a far-off wave. The silence that surrounded him was deafening. He could hear the pounding of his own heart in his ears, the rush of his breath coming in shallow gasps. He felt the weight of his situation crashing down on him. Alone. Stranded. 1,000 miles. From help, with nothing but the endless stretch of fjord in every direction. His boat, his life's work, was now nothing more than a sinking wreck somewhere behind him. There was no way he could go back for it. The orcas had made sure of that. The boat was gone, and so was his chance at survival if he didn't act quickly. The raft was small, barely enough to keep him above water. He had no supplies, no provisions. Only the thin, damp clothes on his back and the lifeline that was the radio. Still silent, still useless. His hands shook as he checked it again, pressing the distress button, but there was nothing. No signal. No help. Come on, Tom muttered to himself, pressing the button once more. The radio crackled faintly, a sound so distant it made him feel like he was already in another world. He dropped it back into the raft, feeling a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He couldn't stay here. If he didn't get to shore soon, he wouldn't make it. He glanced around, searching for any sign of land, but the fog that had rolled in earlier was thickening again. It swallowed the distant hills, the jagged peaks that had once seemed so inviting. Now, they were lost, hidden by the murky gray fog that had enveloped the fjords. Then a noise broke the stillness, a deep rumble beneath him, vibrating through the raft. It came from below, from the depths. The water around him shifted as if the ocean itself was breathing. His breath caught in his throat, and his eyes darted frantically over the water. He saw it before he heard it, the shadow that moved beneath. The surface, swift and ominous, cutting through the water like a knife. The faintest ripple spread outward, and then, from below, the unmistakable dorsal fin of an orca broke the surface. It was alone, a single silent predator, but there was no mistaking what it was. Tom's heart jumped into his throat. "Not again," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the crashing of his heartbeat. He felt his pulse surge as the orca's sleek body slid through the water, moving in a steady, deliberate path toward him. The size of it was staggering. It was just a single orca this time, but the terror that gripped him was the same. It was the same animal that had destroyed his boat, the same intelligence behind those cold, black eyes. The orca came closer, its movements graceful, precise, almost calculating. Its large, dark eye locked on him, and Tom froze. His muscles tensed, every fiber of his being screaming to move, to paddle, to do anything to escape. But he was paralyzed, staring at the creature. He couldn't tear his eyes away. It wasn't just a predator, it was something else, something far more terrifying. It was a creature that understood what it was doing. It was a hunter, not an animal acting on instinct alone. It was smart. The orca's body rose slightly above the water, its mouth opening and closing in a soundless motion, as if tasting the air. Tom instinctively reached for the paddle, his hand trembling as he grasped it. But his mind was clouded with fear. There was no point in trying to escape. This thing was faster, smarter, and it wasn't afraid of him. He pressed the paddle into the water with a half-hearted stroke, but the orca didn't move away. Instead, it lunged toward him, moving in, an arc so swift and unexpected that Tom barely had time to react. With a violent splash, the orca struck the side of the raft with its massive tail, sending a shockwave through the water. The force of it was so strong that the raft tilted dangerously to one side, and Tom was thrown off balance, his hand slipping from the paddle. "God damn it!" he shouted, his voice breaking as he fought to right himself, his other hand grasping the edge of the raft. His body ached and the cold water soaked into his bones, but there was no time to waste. The orca was circling, its body shifting beneath the water with a fluidity that was almost hypnotic. Another strike came, this one even harder, and Tom grunted as the raft rocked violently, nearly capsizing. His breath caught in his throat as the raft lurched to the side, the edge dipping beneath the waterline for a moment before it righted itself. The orca was pushing against the raft, trying to capsize it, trying to force Tom into the water where it could finish what it had started. "Stay back!" Tom yelled, desperation creeping into his voice as he clutched the raft tighter, his fingers raw from the cold. He pushed himself away from the side, trying to put distance between himself and the predator, but the orca was relentless. It came again, striking with the same precision as before, slamming its tail into the side of the raft. The raft bucked and groaned, and Tom's stomach lurched as he felt himself lose his grip. The cold water splashed up around him as he fought to stay on the raft, his body moving instinctively now, driven by sheer survival. He scrambled across the raft, trying to keep it steady, but it was clear that the orca wasn't going to let him escape. The creature was circling, its eye never leaving him, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Tom's thoughts raced, but there was nothing he could do. The orca was playing with him just as the pod had done with his boat. It wasn't hunting for food, it was hunting for sport, toying with its prey, wearing him down. And it was working. His limbs were heavy with exhaustion, and his mind was clouded with fear. The realization that he was completely at the mercy of this creature, the ocean's perfect predator, was almost too much to bear. Another crash. This time, the orca lunged forward from beneath, its massive body rising from the depths in an almost graceful arc. It hit the raft with enough force to send Tom sprawling to the opposite side. The impact was deafening, and the raft groaned under the pressure. Tom's chest tightened. He gasped for air, his eyes wide with terror. The orca was right there, just beneath the surface, its sleek black body emerging again. This time, Tom was ready. As the orca approached, he swung the paddle with everything he had, landing a weak, ineffective blow against the side of its body. It was nothing. The orca didn't flinch. It barely seemed to notice. The raft rocked again, and Tom's body lurched violently, his grip slipping from the edge. His heart raced as he struggled to maintain control, but it was clear that the orca wasn't done. It had one goal in mind: to break him. With a final, terrifying breach, the orca surfaced beside the raft again. This time, Tom saw it clearly, its mouth open, its teeth visible in the dim light as it breached the water. He could see its powerful muscles rippling beneath the skin. The size of it was overwhelming. This wasn't just an animal. It was a force of nature. "Please, just leave me alone," Tom begged, his voice cracking with fear and desperation. He reached for the flare gun again, but his hands were shaking so violently he couldn't hold it steady. The orca didn't respond to his plea. Instead, it dove again, disappearing beneath the raft with a sudden, violent movement. Tom's breath caught in his throat as he scrambled to keep the raft steady, his heart pounding louder than the crashing of the waves. He didn't dare look over the side. He knew what was coming. He could feel it. The orca struck again, but this time it wasn't a tail strike. It was a full-body attack, the weight of the creature's massive form crashing against the side of the raft. The raft tilted sharply, and Tom's grip failed him entirely. He was thrown into the water with a scream, the cold water swallowing him whole. Tom's body slammed into the icy depths, the shock of the cold making his heart race, even faster. He kicked violently, trying to swim, but the water was dark and thick with the churn from the orca's attack. He gasped, his chest burning as he broke the surface, but he couldn't get back to the raft. The orca was closing in, its silhouette looming beneath him. Panic seized him as the orca's massive body rose from the depths, its eye fixed on him. Tom could feel its gaze like a weight pressing down on him. He had to get out of the water, he had to survive. But there was nowhere to run, there was no escape. The last thing Tom saw before he was submerged again was the sharp, sleek dorsal fin cutting through the water toward him. Tom's head broke the surface of the water with a violent gasp, his lungs burning as he fought to take in air. The cold of the fjord bit through him like needles, and his entire body trembled as if it were being pulled apart from the inside out. His hands instinctively reached for the surface of the water, but there was nothing to grab, nothing to hold on to. The raft was gone. The orca had capsized it, and now Tom was alone in the open water. He kicked his legs, desperately trying to stay afloat, but the water was like ice. His body was numb and his mind was slipping into a haze of panic. Every part of him screamed for him to survive, to fight back, but all he could focus on was the weight of the water pulling at him, trying to drag him down. And then he saw it, the dorsal fin. A chill of terror surged through him as the black, sleek shape cut through the water, moving toward him with a purpose. The orca. His heart pounded, the thundering beat of his pulse matching the force of the waves crashing against him. Tom's body was exhausted from fighting the elements, and the cold was slowly creeping into his bones, but he couldn't afford to stop. He couldn't afford to slow down. Not with that thing circling beneath him. The orca surfaced, its enormous body rising from the water in a smooth arc. Its black and white skin gleamed in the weak light, and its eye, so dark, so cold, locked onto his. Tom froze. The creature was intelligent, he knew that. The way it circled him, the way it waited. God, please, he whispered through clenched teeth, his voice barely more than a breath. He felt the weight of its gaze on him. His muscles screamed for him to swim, to fight, but every instinct told him to freeze, to wait, to do nothing. But the orca wasn't waiting. It wasn't observing. It was moving in on him. Tom's pulse quickened. He could hear the orca's low, rhythmic breathing through the water. He could feel the vibrations of its movements beneath him. And then, before he could react, its massive tail slapped the water with a powerful force, sending a surge of water crashing over Tom's head. The raft was gone. His escape was gone, and now, the orca was intent on finishing what it had started. A blast of cold air filled Tom's lungs as he resurfaced, gasping. He had to think. His mind was spinning. He was slipping into shock, but he had to force himself to stay focused. The orca was just beneath him, and if he couldn't make it to land, if he couldn't escape, he was dead. The orca's body glided under him again, moving with terrifying ease through the water. Its dorsal fin sliced the surface like a blade, and Tom's eyes were locked on it, unable to look away. There was nowhere to go, no way to fight. The water was too cold, he was too exhausted. But still he couldn't let it end like this. "Get away from me!" Tom screamed, his voice raw with desperation. He raised his hands above the water, but it was futile. The orca had no interest in being deterred. It breached once again, this time right next to him, its enormous mouth snapping open as if to grab him. Tom recoiled, throwing his arms out instinctively to protect himself. The sound of the orca's body crashing back into the water was deafening, the force of it sending another wave of water over Tom, nearly drowning him as he struggled to stay afloat. The chill seeped deeper into his bones, and his breath was coming in gasps, his chest constricting with fear. He couldn't stay above water much longer. With every stroke of his arms, every kick of his legs, he could feel himself weakening. The orca was still there, its eye following him, its massive form rising and falling just beneath the surface, so close that Tom could almost touch it, but there was nothing he could do. He had no strength left to fight. His limbs felt like lead as he struggled to keep his head above water. The cold was unbearable. The terror was suffocating. And all the while the orca circled, its movements deliberate, its patience unnerving. Tom's vision began to blur. His body was shutting down from the cold, his movements sluggish, his thoughts disjointed. He had to make it to land. He couldn't die here in the fjord at the mercy of this predator. But the orca wasn't giving him the luxury of time. It was moving again, circling beneath him, closing in. And then, it lunged. The water around him exploded in a cascade of frothy white waves as the orca surged upward. Tom screamed, his heart pounding. But the orca's jaws snapped shut just inches from him, a terrifying snap that echoed through the water. The force of the attack sent him spinning in the water, disoriented, his breath stolen from him as the orca dove again just beneath the surface. Tom's mind raced, his body disoriented from the impact. His heart was hammering and his chest ached from the cold. The fear, the exhaustion. He couldn't think straight. The raft was gone. His escape was gone. And now he was nothing more than a floating target for this merciless creature. He needed to get away. He needed to survive. His body screamed as he forced himself to swim, every stroke slow and labored. He couldn't see the orca now, but he could feel it moving beneath him, its presence palpable, its cold intelligence never leaving him for a second. It was hunting him. Please. Tom's voice was barely a whisper, the sound drowned by the crashing waves. Not like this. He swam harder, his arms and legs feeling like dead weight. But the orca wasn't finished with him. The surface of the water shifted once again, and Tom's heart froze as he saw the dorsal fin rise up in the distance, cutting through the water, moving swiftly toward him. The orca was coming for him again. Tom's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't stop it. He couldn't fight it. It was too powerful, too fast. The orca had him trapped and there was no escaping it. A sudden violent strike from below rocked his body, and Tom's world exploded in a blinding flash of cold and fear. The orca had struck, slamming into him with enough force to send him spiraling under the water, his body tossed like a rag doll in the chaos. He fought to kick to break free from the suffocating grasp of the water, but it was too much. The cold, the force of the strike. It was all too much. He couldn't keep going. With a last, desperate attempt, Tom's hands reached out, his fingers grazing something solid. A rock. He clung to it, his body crashing against the sharp surface, desperate for anything to hold on to. The orca circled beneath him, the water churning violently as the beast moved just out of reach. Tom's body was shaking uncontrollably, but he didn't let go. He couldn't. This was his only chance. Gasping for air, he dragged himself over the sharp rock, his fingers bleeding from the effort. He scrambled, his hands weak, but the stone beneath him was solid. And as his body collapsed against it, he felt the sharp sting of safety. The orca's body moved once again beneath him, but it did not attack. For a long moment, Tom could do nothing but cling to the rock, gasping for air, his body racked with exhaustion and cold. He could hear the orca's calls, low and eerie, drifting up from the depths, but it was not attacking. It was simply waiting. Tom couldn't look at the water anymore. He couldn't think about the orca below him, or how close he had come to death. All he could do was breathe, his chest rising, and falling in short, painful gasps. His body was shaking with the aftershock of fear, but he had survived. For now. And yet, as he clung to the rock in the cold, unforgiving water, he couldn't shake the feeling that the orca was still there, waiting. He had no idea what the next few hours or days would bring, but for now he had escaped. Just barely. Tom's limbs were heavy with exhaustion, his body shaking uncontrollably as he clung to the jagged rock. His fingers were raw, bleeding from the struggle to keep hold of his lifeline in the middle of the fjord, and his mind was clouded with both panic and an overwhelming sense of numbness. The cold, biting wind whipped through his drenched clothes, and the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks was deafening. He had barely managed to drag himself onto the ledge, his legs trembling, but he was here, alive. But the orca, he couldn't stop thinking about it. Every movement beneath the water, every sound from the depths, was a reminder that the predator was still there, waiting. It had not attacked again, but Tom could feel the weight of its presence, hovering just beneath the surface. His breath came in short, painful bursts as he tried to steady himself. He needed to think, but his mind was a blur. His body was exhausted, his energy spent, and every inch of him ached. He had survived the brutal attack and had somehow made it to the rocky outcrop. But he knew he couldn't stay here forever. He had to find shelter. He had to get to safety. But how? His eyes scanned the fjord, the fog thickening once again, shrouding everything in a thick gray veil. The towering cliffs of the fjord seemed to reach out toward him like dark fingers, and the cold water which had almost claimed him stretched out endlessly, a vast, unwelcoming expanse. The shore was too far, and he had no idea how to navigate the terrain without risking another encounter with the orca. His stomach twisted with hunger, but that was the least of his problems. The overwhelming terror of his situation, the fear that still clung to him like a second skin, was what truly consumed him. Every small sound, every ripple in the water made his heart race, his breath catch in his chest. It was as if the world had become a blur, reduced to only two things: him and the orca. The rest of reality seemed so distant, so intangible. There was nothing left to hold on to but the cold, the fear, and the gnawing ache in his bones. He pressed his back against the rock, feeling the cold stone bite into his skin as he tried to steady himself. His body ached for rest, but he knew he couldn't afford to fall asleep. He couldn't let his guard down. The orca was still out there, somewhere, and he had no idea how long it would take before it would strike again. He was prey, and he knew it. But something shifted in the air, a sudden change. The hair on the back of his neck prickled and he tensed, his body instinctively ready for another attack. The sound of the water shifted, ripples forming on the surface, moving in a direction that made his blood run cold. The orca was approaching again, its dorsal fin slicing through the water like a dark omen. Tom's heart began to race. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to gather his thoughts, but the fear was all-consuming. He had to think, to act, but his body felt like lead. His breath came in ragged bursts, and the world around him seemed to shrink into a tight, suffocating space. The orca was moving closer, its sleek black and white form rising from the depths with terrifying speed. "Come on," Tom whispered, his voice breaking. "Just leave me alone." The water rippled again, and this time, he could see the orca's massive body moving beneath the surface, its presence like a shadow beneath the water's sheen. Tom's hands shook as he gripped the rock tighter, his knuckles white. The orca surfaced once more, its enormous body cutting through the water as it closed in on the ledge. Tom couldn't move. He couldn't fight it. He was trapped, his options disappearing with each passing second. His body ached from the cold, and his muscles screamed in protest. His mind was foggy, clouded with exhaustion, but there was no escape. The orca was closing in on him. He was out of time. He could hear it now, the deep, low clicks and whistles of the orca echoing through the fjord. The sounds were like a language, a communication that made Tom feel small, insignificant. This creature was hunting. It was playing with him. And he couldn't outrun it. Not here. Not in this vast, empty space. The orca's dorsal fin rose higher, slicing through the water as it approached the rock. Tom's pulse thundered in his ears, each beat a reminder of how close he was to death. He could see the orca's eye, black and cold, locked onto him. The creature was watching him, studying him. He was prey, and the orca knew it. Tom's breath caught in his throat. "Please," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Please, just go away." But the orca wasn't interested in mercy. It didn't care about his fear or his desperate pleas. It was simply doing what nature had programmed it to do. Hunt. Kill. Survive. The orca closed in. Tom's heart felt like it was going to burst from his chest as he watched the creature approach, its movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. The orca's body rose from the depths with an eerie grace, and Tom could feel the weight of its power in the air. It was massive, a force of nature, a predator who knew exactly how to strike. Tom couldn't breathe. His muscles were locked in place, frozen with fear. He couldn't think. All he could do was wait for the inevitable. But just as the orca's mouth opened, its teeth gleaming in the dim light, something unexpected happened. The sound of a distant motor broke through the tension. A boat. A rescue boat. Tom's head snapped up, his eyes darting toward the sound. His heart surged with a sudden wave of hope, but fear and doubt mixed with it. Was it really a rescue? Or had the orca somehow been summoned by the sound of the motor? The orca paused, Its sleek black body shifted, and for a moment, everything stopped. The boat was closer now, the motor's hum unmistakable. Tom's breath caught in his throat as he realized that he wasn't alone anymore. Someone was coming for him. The orca, sensing the change in the environment, seemed to hesitate, its movements slowing. It was no longer the solitary predator. It was now part of a larger, more unpredictable world. The boat appeared through the fog, a small figure emerging from the mist as it came into view. Tom's chest tightened with a mixture of relief and disbelief. It was a fisherman, one of the locals. He was making his way directly toward Tom's rock outcropping, unaware of the danger that lurked just beneath the surface. Tom's mind raced. Was this the help he had been praying for? Or was the orca waiting for the right moment to strike, using the boat's presence to its advantage? The fisherman's voice carried over the waves, faint but clear. "Hey, are you all right?" Tom's mouth was dry. He had to respond, but his voice was hoarse, barely more than a rasp. He cleared his throat, trying to call out, but nothing came. His body was still shaking from the terror of the last few hours, his voice failing him. "Help!" he managed, the word coming out ragged, almost a whisper. "Help! Please!" The fisherman's boat moved closer, the figure standing at the helm, looking over at Tom. "Hold on, I'm coming for you," the man called out, his voice strong but filled with concern. But the orca wasn't done. As the boat came closer, the orca surged forward, its massive body slashing through the water. The fisherman had no idea what was coming. The sound of the orca's tail slapping against the water filled the air, and Tom's heart skipped a beat as the creature closed in, faster than he had ever seen. "No!" Tom shouted, the word tearing from his chest. His instincts took over, his body moving in a desperate, frantic motion as he pushed himself to his feet, trying to wave the fisherman off to warn him. But it was too late. The orca broke the surface, its massive body lunging toward the boat with a force that sent shockwaves through the water. The boat rocked violently, its hull splintering from the impact as the orca collided with it. Tom could only watch in horror as the fisherman was thrown into the water, helpless, the boat sinking in a matter of seconds. "No! Help!" Tom screamed, again, but the words were useless. The orca was in control now. The fisherman was struggling in the water, his body flailing, but he was no match for the predator. Tom's heart was pounding in his chest, a wave of guilt crashing over him as he realized that the orca had not just been after him. It had been after both of them. The orca had been toying with him, but now, with the fisherman in the water, it had found its new target. Tom's mind raced, but he couldn't help. The fisherman was too far. The orca was too powerful. The boat sank into the water, disappearing beneath the surface with a final, terrible lurch. Tom could hear the struggle, the frantic splashing, but there was nothing he could do. The orca had claimed its prize. The fjord was silent once more, the water still and calm, as if nothing had happened at all. The rescue was over before it had even begun. Tom could only stare in horror, knowing that there was no escape for either of them. He was alone once more, with nothing left but the cold, the fear, and the ever-present shadow of the orca beneath. The waves. The hours felt like days as Tom sat in the cold, his eyes locked on the water that stretched endlessly before him. His muscles screamed with exhaustion, and his body was stiff with the remnants of the cold that had gripped him for so long. The sun had begun its descent, casting a pale orange hue over the fjord, but it offered little warmth. Every part of him ached, and every movement seemed like a monumental effort. He hadn't moved much since the orca's last strike, still perched on the jagged rock where he had sought refuge. The night was beginning to fall, the fog thickening, creeping in from the depths of the fjord like a slow-moving tide. It was hard to tell what was real and what was his own mind unraveling, but the weight of the silence was almost unbearable. The orca had disappeared, but its presence still loomed large in his mind. Every ripple in the water, every gust of wind, felt like a threat. He couldn't relax, couldn't let his guard down, not even for a second. The fisherman. He couldn't stop thinking about the fisherman. Tom's mind kept returning to the man's desperate face, his wild thrashing in the water as the orca closed in. He could still hear the sound of the boat splintering, the screams fading away into the distance. The orca had been swift, merciless, and the fisherman had been nothing more than a casualty, another victim of nature's unyielding cruelty. Tom couldn't save him. He had barely managed to save himself. The guilt ate at him. The overwhelming sense of helplessness clung to him, suffocating him as if every breath he took was tainted by his inability to do anything. He had tried to warn the man. He had screamed, but the distance between them had been too much. And the orca, it was too much. What was he supposed to do? The realization that he was utterly powerless in the face of such raw, natural force tore at him, leaving him hollow. Why? He muttered to himself, the words breaking through his throat. He swallowed hard, but his mouth was dry, his tongue thick from the salt water. Why did I survive? Why him? Why not me? He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head as he lowered it into his hands. His thoughts were spiraling, mixing with the overwhelming exhaustion. The weight of his isolation pressed down on him, each moment more unbearable than the last. The smell of salt water, the sound of the wind, the endless murmur of the water below, him. It was all starting to blur together. And then he heard it, a soft rumble like the far-off sound of thunder, followed by a sharp slap against the water. Tom's head shot up, his heart leaping into his throat. His eyes scanned the fjord, his body stiff with terror. It was impossible to tell at first, but the movement, the sudden ripple in the water, he knew what it was. The orca. It had returned. His blood ran cold, his breath caught in his throat, and his pulse quickened. The water was still, eerily, still except for the faintest ripple that now seemed to draw closer, expanding slowly like the calm before a storm. Tom's mind raced. He couldn't afford to panic. He had survived so far by holding on, by fighting for every breath, every moment. But this, it was different. The orca had found him before. It had toyed with him before. He knew it wouldn't stop. The dorsal fin broke the surface again, cutting through the water with sharp precision. This time there was no mistaking it. The orca was coming directly toward him. Not again, Tom whispered, his voice cracking. His first instinct was to run, but there was nowhere to run to. The rocky outcrop he had perched on was isolated, and even if he did make it to the shoreline, he was no match for the speed of the orca. The creature could close the distance in seconds. He was trapped. A rush of cold fear shot through his body as he scrambled for purchase on the jagged rock. His hands, still raw from the earlier struggle, fumbled for a better grip as he fought to steady himself. He had to move, to act. He couldn't just sit here and wait for the inevitable. But there was nothing except the growing sense of doom that consumed him. Think, he urged himself, forcing his mind to work. His pulse was hammering in his chest, but he couldn't let the fear take over. He needed a plan. He needed to. The orca surfaced, its body rising from the water with smooth, powerful movements. The sleek black and white form gleamed in the fading light, and Tom felt his throat tighten as he watched it approach. The water seemed to bend and swirl around it, the sheer force of its movement making the fjord feel like it was alive. Breathing and waiting, the orca was getting closer. Tom's breathing became shallow as he tried to push himself off the rock, his muscles protesting with every movement. He couldn't stay here. He needed to make a decision, to act fast, but his thoughts were a blur of terror and desperation. The orca was just beneath him now, its black eye fixed on him, as if it were savoring the moment. Tom's heart thudded painfully in his chest. He was prey. Please, he breathed, his voice barely a whisper. The orca swam closer, circling the rock, its body moving with a terrifying grace, its presence so overwhelming that it felt like the world itself had narrowed down to the two of them, Tom and the orca, predator and prey. There was no escape. There was no mercy. And then, as if in slow motion, the orca surged toward him. Tom's mind screamed for him to move, to do anything, but his body was frozen. He could feel the pulse of the orca's movements beneath him, the power of it, the sheer inevitability of what was about to happen. The rock beneath his hands was slick with seawater, and his fingers slipped, his grip faltering. The orca lunged again, its body rising from the water in a smooth arc, its mouth open wide. The force of the attack sent a spray of water flying, and Tom screamed as he instinctively raised his arms, bracing for impact. But this time something changed. Just as the orca closed in, a sound broke through the tension. An unmistakable hum of a motor, a distant noise that cut through the fog and the sound of the water. Tom's head snapped toward the sound, his heart leaping in his chest as the boat appeared, cutting through the mist like a beacon of hope. It was a small fishing boat, the kind that could navigate the narrow fjords, but it was too far, too distant. Tom's breath caught in his throat as he realized that the orca might already have taken notice of the approaching boat. Would the predator abandon its hunt, or would it see this as a new challenge? His fingers tightened around the rock, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if he could even stand. The orca was still circling, its large black eye never leaving him, but the boat was coming closer now, the sound of the engine growing louder. Tom's mind raced. "Help!" he shouted, his voice hoarse from hours of terror and exposure. "Help me!" The boat's engine roared as it cut through the fog, moving faster now as it neared Tom's position. The fisherman didn't seem to notice the orca at first, his attention focused on the shore, on the rocks that were visible just ahead. Tom's heart hammered in his chest as he waved his arms, desperate to attract attention. The orca didn't retreat. It surged forward again, its tail slapping the water, causing the raft of waves to crash around Tom. The boat was close now, within reach. The fisherman's head turned, and their eyes locked for a brief moment. Tom could see the confusion, the concern in the fisherman's gaze. He was almost there. "Stay back!" Tom yelled, waving his arms frantically. "It's too dangerous! Get away!" But it was too late. The orca struck with terrifying speed, surging toward the boat with a force that was almost beyond comprehension. The fisherman had no chance to react as the massive creature slammed into the side of the boat, sending it reeling, water rushing into the hull. Tom screamed in horror as the boat tilted. The fisherman tossed into the water like a rag doll, his body disappearing beneath the surface. "No! No!" Tom screamed, his hands scrambling desperately at the rock as he tried to keep his footing. The orca was relentless, its movements brutal and precise. Tom's mind raced as the water churned around him, the orca returning to finish what it had started. He wasn't sure how much longer he could hold on. He had already lost so much. Would he be next? As the boat sank into the depths, the orca retreated, its massive form disappearing beneath the water. Tom could barely breathe as he stared at the empty space where the fisherman had been moments before, his mind struggling to grasp what had just happened. The fjord was quiet now, too quiet, and Tom was alone again, isolated, abandoned, and unsure if he would make it through the night. His thoughts, blurred with terror and exhaustion, turned inward. He had survived the orca once. But could he survive again? The sun was almost gone, its light fading fast as the fjord settled into an oppressive, dim twilight. Tom's breath came in ragged gasps, the strain of his body, his mind weighing him down. His skin had gone pale from exposure, his muscles aching from hours of holding on to the jagged rock. The orca had finally retreated after the fisherman's boat had gone under. And now, Tom was left with nothing but the remnants of terror and cold dread. The creature hadn't returned yet, but Tom knew it was out there, somewhere in the dark waters, lurking beneath the surface, waiting. He had to move. It was the only thought that persisted through the fog in his mind. He couldn't stay on this rock. He couldn't survive here. He had seen the brutality of the predator, and if it came back, he would be a sitting target. He had to get to land, anywhere away from the open water. The rocks around him were sharp, cutting into his palms as he pulled himself from his precarious perch. His legs shook with weakness, but he forced himself to stand, his body screaming in protest. He had to focus. He had to think. His eyes scanned the fog-covered fjord, searching for anything that could help him. The shoreline was barely visible, the faint outline of land shrouded by mist and growing shadows. It was too far for his tired body to reach. And yet, it was the only option. For a moment, Tom considered the possibility of simply staying put, waiting until morning. He was exhausted, starved, and too weak to keep going. His limbs felt heavy, and his thoughts were clouded by the fog of his own terror and pain. But there was no comfort in that thought. No guarantee of safety. The orca could return at any moment. It had been circling him, toying with him for hours, and now he had no boat to protect him. No escape. With a shuddering breath, Tom gathered what little strength he had left and began to climb down the rock face. Each movement was painful, but the need to survive overpowered everything else. He couldn't die here, alone in this cold, dark world. Not like the fishermen, not like so many others who had vanished into the vast, indifferent sea. His feet found purchase on the wet rocks as he descended, carefully, slowly, not trusting his body to hold steady for long. His shoes were ruined, soaked through with seawater, and his clothes were stiff and heavy against his skin. He was cold, but there was nothing he could do about it now. He was still alive, that was all that mattered, for now. The water was choppy around him as he waded through the shallows, his heart pounding in his chest. He had made it down to the edge of the water, and now he had to move. He glanced back at the rock he had clung to for so long, its dark silhouette against the gray sky, and then looked toward the shore. The distance was far, but it was the only path forward. Tom's feet slipped on the wet rocks as he pushed himself forward, moving quickly despite his exhaustion. His legs burned, his muscles sore and stiff, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't think about the pain. He had to get to land, he had to survive. The orca had shown him how little control he had over his fate. It had shown him the terrifying truth. Out here in the wild, in the sea, nothing was guaranteed. Nothing was safe. Not even his life. The sky darkened even more, the last remnants of sunlight fading into the blackness. The fog thickened, swirling. Around him, the distant sound of the water lapping against the shore, now the only noise he could hear. He kept his eyes fixed on the shore, but every step felt like an eternity. Suddenly, there was a splash. A large one. Tom froze, every muscle in his body tensing at once. He held his breath, his eyes darting around, searching for the source. Was it the orca? Had it come back? The silence that followed felt suffocating. Every movement, every ripple in the water felt like a death sentence. He couldn't stay in the open. He couldn't stay exposed. His mind raced as he stepped back, his feet slipping on the rocks as he sought refuge behind a large outcrop of stone. He pressed his back against the cold surface, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he waited, listening. His pulse thudded in his ears and his throat was dry. He couldn't see the orca, but the fear that it was closing in on him consumed every thought. The water shifted again, and Tom's heart leaped into his throat as he saw the dorsal fin emerge from the water, cutting through the surface like a razor. There it was. The orca. It had found him. His breath caught in his throat. He could see the shape of it now, the black and white form rising from the water, its sleek body gliding effortlessly through the waves. It was circling him, moving deliberately as if savoring the chase. Tom's mind screamed at him to move, to get out of the water, to run, but his body felt frozen, paralyzed by the terror that had been building in him for so long. He couldn't move. He couldn't escape. The orca closed in. It was close now, just a few yards away, and Tom could feel the vibrations in the water as the creature moved beneath him. Its sharp, dark eye glinted in the fading light as it locked onto him. It was watching him, studying him, waiting for the right moment. Tom's pulse quickened, his chest tightening with every passing second. His breath was coming in desperate, shallow gasps as he fought to stay calm. His mind raced with the harsh truth. He wasn't ready to die. Not like this. Not at the mercy of an animal that was so much more powerful than him. With an almost unnatural precision, the orca dove beneath the surface, disappearing from view. Tom's heart thudded painfully in his chest as he watched the water, waiting for the next move. But the orca didn't surface immediately. Instead, it was silent, watching, waiting. Tom's hands trembled as he grasped a rock, his fingers scraping against the rough surface. He had no plan, no strategy. He had nothing left but sheer will. The fear gripped him, holding him in place, keeping him from moving. The orca was watching him just beneath the surface, its dark presence hovering like a shadow over him. And then, the orca surged forward. It shot from the water with terrifying speed, its massive body breaking the surface with a resounding splash. Tom barely had time to react as the orca moved toward him, its jaws snapping open in an instinctive predatory move. His mind screamed at him to move. He had to escape. He couldn't let it happen again. In a burst of adrenaline, he pushed, off the rocks, kicking his legs, trying to swim, trying to move fast enough to escape the predator that was closing in on him. But it was too fast. Its movements were a blur beneath the water, its body slicing through the depths like a spear. The orca was close. Too close. Tom's chest burned as he fought the current, his heart thundering in his ears. He could hear the orca's clicks, low and guttural, vibrating in his bones. It was moving in for the kill. He was no longer the hunter, no longer in control. He was prey, and the orca was the one who held all the power. He was trapped. There was nowhere to go. The water surged around him as the orca closed in, its sharp fins cutting through the water. Tom's mind went blank for a second, his vision narrowing as he stared at the orca's huge open mouth, the teeth gleaming in the dim light. In that instant, Tom realized something. He wasn't just afraid for his life. He was afraid for his survival. But more than that, he was afraid of the fact that the orca was simply doing what it had been born to do. It wasn't personal. It wasn't about him. It was just a predator doing what predators do. And in that moment he understood. The orca wasn't going to stop until it had completed its hunt. It was relentless. But so was he. With a final burst of strength, Tom threw himself forward, his legs kicking furiously as he pushed toward the shore. Desperate to escape the creature that had haunted him for hours, the orca's body surged beneath him again, but this time Tom was faster. His hand scraped across the rocks as he reached the shore, pulling himself out of the water just as the orca dove beneath the surface again, disappearing into the depths. Panting, his body shaking with exhaustion, Tom collapsed onto the shore, his fingers gripping the wet earth. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The orca was gone. For now. But Tom had survived, and that was all that mattered. The shore was quiet now, save for the distant sound of waves crashing against the jagged rocks. Tom lay flat on the cold, wet ground, his body aching from the hours of exertion, fear, and exposure. His clothes were drenched, his skin pale and bruised from the relentless pounding of the sea. He had no idea how long he had been lying there, but the sun was setting, its final rays casting an eerie golden light over the fjord. He had made it, somehow. Against all odds, he had survived. But as the last of the daylight disappeared, leaving only the vast expanse of darkness in front of him, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The orca had gone, or so it seemed, but its presence was still with him, lingering in the deep, silent waters. The memories of the creature's power, its cold intelligence, were seared into his mind, and they wouldn't let him go. Tom pushed himself into a sitting position, his legs trembling beneath him. He could barely stand. His body was drained, every muscle aching as if they had been put through a wringer. The cold had seeped into his bones, and the hunger gnawed at him relentlessly. But his mind was still sharp, too sharp. He could still hear the sound of the orca's tail slapping. The water, the way it had circled him, studied him like he was nothing more than a passing thought. He needed to move. He needed to keep going, to find shelter, warmth, food. He couldn't afford to stop now, not when he was so close. Not when he had come so far. His throat was dry, parched from the salt water, but there was no time to worry about that. The shore ahead of him was jagged, rocky, impossible to navigate with a frail body like his, but he had no choice. There was nowhere else to go. He couldn't stay on the rocks, he couldn't stay near the water. The orca had proven that. It was waiting, it was watching, and it would come again if he gave it the chance. The wind howled around him, carrying, with it, the scent of salt and damp earth. Tom shivered uncontrollably as he pushed himself up, his fingers scraping against the wet rocks for leverage. He stumbled, his vision blurry as he fought to stand, his body screaming in protest. His legs felt like rubber, like they would give out at any moment. But he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when the danger was still out there. He took a tentative step forward, then another. His breathing shallow, his chest tight. Every step felt like it could be his last. His mind was consumed with the thought of the orca. Would it come back? Would it find him again? Would he ever be free of it? The rocky terrain was treacherous, but Tom pressed on, moving with what little strength he had left. His feet slipped on the wet stones, but he managed to find steady ground. The shore ahead was littered with debris, broken branches, rotting, seaweed and small rocks that seemed to jut out at odd angles. The landscape felt alien to him now, strange and hostile. He couldn't think of the fjord as he had before, not with the orca's memory haunting him. God, I'm not going to make it, he muttered under his breath. The words a whisper lost in the wind. But even as the thought crossed his mind, something deep within him refused to accept it. He had come this far, hadn't he? The orca hadn't killed him. The fisherman hadn't been so lucky. But Tom had survived. And he would keep surviving. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in hours he let himself believe that he could make it out of this alive. He had to. The first nightfall was coming quickly. The shadows deepened, the last flickers of light from the sun fading into the inky darkness. Tom could feel the cold bite into his skin, and the hunger in his stomach gnawed at him, relentless, insistent. He had no food, no water. The exhaustion was creeping in again, threatening to pull him under. His mind began to wander, slipping into delirium. The sound of the waves became muffled, like he was hearing them from far away. The cold felt like it was pressing down on him, the weight of it settling into his bones, until every breath became more and more labored. You've made it this far. Keep going, Tom muttered to himself, his voice hoarse and cracked. Just keep moving. Just keep going. The words felt meaningless, but he clung to them. He had to keep going. His legs felt like lead as he stumbled forward again, finding a path that led up toward the rocky cliffs. He had no real direction, no plan. But somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew that higher ground would give him a better view. He couldn't afford to be caught by surprise again. It felt like hours before he found a small cave-like indentation in the rock, a crude shelter, but it was something. He collapsed to the ground, his knees buckling beneath him as he fell into the makeshift shelter. His body trembled uncontrollably, his teeth chattering from the cold as he curled into a ball, trying to conserve what little warmth he had left. The cave was small, just enough to shield him from the wind. The darkness pressed in on him like a living thing, and Tom felt the isolation closing in. For the first time since he had encountered the orca, he allowed himself to give in to the fear that had been gnawing at him for hours. Why didn't it just kill me? He whispered, his voice barely a murmur against the wind. What does it want from me? There was no answer, only the eerie sound of the waves crashing against the rocks below. He huddled into himself, his eyes fluttering closed as exhaustion took over. He wasn't sure how long he lay there, trapped between sleep and wakefulness, his body too tired to keep moving but too terrified to let himself drift off entirely. But eventually, sleep won. His mind swam with fragmented images. The orca, its huge black eye, the fisherman's face as the boat was capsized, the feeling of helplessness, of drowning in an ocean far too vast for him to understand. When he woke, the world was still, dark. The silence was oppressive, and he knew instantly that something had changed. The air felt heavier, colder. Tom rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the dizziness, but the feeling in his gut told him that it wasn't just the exhaustion. Something else was out there, something that hadn't left. He tried to push the thought away, but it clung to him, lingering like a shadow in his mind. His instincts screamed at him to move, to get up and run, but his body felt sluggish, weighed down by fatigue. But he had to move. He had to. Steeling himself, Tom pushed out of the shelter, the cold air biting at his skin as he stumbled to his feet. He wiped his eyes, trying to clear the fog that clouded his thoughts. He had to get out. But where? The answer came to him in a flash of clarity. The hills. He had seen them earlier, distant and dark against the fog, and for the first time, he felt an urgency. He had to climb. It wasn't just about finding food or warmth anymore, it was about distance. He had to get away from the water, away from the fjord. The journey up was a battle, each step more painful than the last, his legs weak and uncooperative. The wind howled as if it was mocking him. But Tom pressed on, his mind numb, his focus on nothing but the path ahead. He was so close now. So close to escaping the grip of the sea, the feeling of being hunted. He couldn't afford to stop, he couldn't afford to think. Every thought, every fear, every doubt had to be pushed aside. And then, as his foot landed on a rocky outcrop, something changed. The air shifted. The distant sound of the waves seemed to quiet. The earth beneath him felt alive, as though it were watching him, waiting for him. The sky was still dark, but the fog had parted slightly, revealing a faint outline of the horizon. Tom's pulse quickened. He didn't know if it was a trick of the mind or if the sea was truly waiting for him to make his final move. Either way, the orca was still there, lurking. It had followed him. It had been watching. But this time, Tom didn't run. This time, he turned, facing the fjord with the strength of everything he had left. He didn't know what he would do next, but he knew one thing for certain. He was still alive. And no matter how long he had left, he wasn't going down without a fight. The wind cut through the fjord like a knife, biting into Tom's skin as he stood at the edge of the rocky cliff, staring out over the water. The night was thick with fog, the silence oppressive, and the world felt like it was holding its breath. Everything was still, too still. But Tom knew better than to trust the quiet. He had learned that the hard way. The orca had disappeared for now, but its memory lingered, an ever-present shadow in his mind. Tom's hands trembled as he gripped the jagged stone beneath him, his fingers raw and aching from the strain. He hadn't slept, hadn't allowed himself to rest. He couldn't, not when every ripple of water, every gust of wind felt like a warning, a reminder that the ocean was watching him. For hours, he had walked, moved with no real direction, no clear plan, just the instinct to put as much distance between himself and the water as possible. The land was rough, treacherous. He stumbled over rocks, his legs weak and unsteady, but he kept moving. Every step forward felt like a victory, a chance to survive. But as the fog rolled in thicker and the wind grew colder, he could feel the weight of his isolation pressing down on him, crushing him under its intensity. There was no one out here. No one to help. No one to save him. The fisherman was gone, swallowed by the sea. The pod of orcas had retreated, but Tom wasn't foolish enough to think it was over. The hunger gnawed at him relentlessly, his stomach a hollow pit. His body was aching from exhaustion, his mind clouded with delirium. But there was still a small part of him that refused to give in. He had made it this far. He couldn't let himself die in the cold, alone on this rocky, unforgiving shore. He had to keep going. He had to find shelter. Tom glanced behind him, his eyes scanning the fog-covered fjord. The water was dark and forbidding, the waves lapping gently against the base of the cliffs. He could feel the presence of the orca, as if it were still lurking out there, waiting for him to make a mistake. He shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. He couldn't keep living in fear. He had to be stronger than that. He began to move again, slowly at first, but then with more urgency. The wind had picked up, howling in his ears as it whipped through his hair and stung his face. He walked with purpose, determined to find higher ground. He needed a vantage point, a place to see what was coming, a place to feel safe if that was even possible. The ground beneath him was uneven, the rocks sharp and jagged, but Tom didn't care. His breath was labored, his legs shaking with fatigue, but he pressed on, his mind fixed on the climb ahead. It was steep, the path barely discernible, but he knew he had to keep moving. The fog was closing in, obscuring his view of the fjord, but he wasn't going to let it stop him. He couldn't. As he climbed higher, the world around him became quieter, the sounds of the water and the wind muffled by the thick fog that had swallowed everything. The cliff's edge was narrow, and every step forward was a gamble, but Tom didn't hesitate. His body was worn, but his mind was sharp, focused only on the next step, the next move. His feet finally found solid ground, and he stumbled onto a plateau, his chest heaving with effort. He didn't stop, didn't even let himself rest for a moment. Instead, he pushed forward, deeper into the rocks. He needed to find shelter before the night completely consumed him. The air was thick with the scent of salt water, and the fog clung to everything, casting the world in an eerie, ghostly light. He could barely see a few feet in front of him, But he didn't let it dissuade him. His eyes darted back and forth, searching for anything that could offer him a modicum of safety. Then he saw it. A small, narrow cave, hidden from view by the rocks and the fog. It was just large enough to provide shelter, enough to protect him from the elements. It wasn't much, but it was something. Tom stumbled toward it, his legs buckling as he crawled inside, the weight of his exhaustion finally taking hold of him. His body collapsed onto the cool, rough ground, and he lay there for a moment gasping for air, his chest rising and falling with each breath. The cave was small, but it was safe. It was a place to rest, to gather himself. For a moment, everything was still. The wind howled outside, but inside the cave it was quiet. The silence was almost suffocating, but Tom welcomed it. He could feel the tension in his body start to loosen, the tight grip of fear easing slightly. He had made it. He was safe, for now. But even as he closed his eyes trying to relax, he could still feel the weight of the sea pressing in on him. The memory of the orca's cold, calculating eye never far from his thoughts. He had seen its power. He had felt its presence. It was a reminder that nothing in this place was predictable, that no matter how far he ran, no matter how much he tried to escape, the ocean would always be there, lurking beneath the surface. Tom's mind raced. The feeling of the orca's gaze, the way it had moved in for the kill, its sharp teeth gleaming in the fading light, it was burned into his mind. He could still hear the sound of its tail slapping the water, the low, eerie clicking of its communication with the other members of its pod. He shuddered at the memory. But the worst part was the way it had toyed with him, the way it had circled him, taunting him. It had been a predator, yes, but it had been more than that. It had been intelligent, calculating. It had known exactly what it was doing. Tom squeezed his eyes shut, trying to push the memories away. He had to focus. He had to stay focused. The orca was gone, for now. He could rest. He could recover. But there was no time to waste. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small emergency flare gun he had found earlier. His fingers were still stiff, but he managed to load it, his hands shaking as he worked. It wasn't much, but it was a signal, a way to call for help, if he needed it. If he could get to higher ground tomorrow, he might be able to use it. Tom placed the flare gun next to him and pulled his knees to his chest, curling into a tight ball as he tried to conserve body heat. His thoughts continued to race, but there was nothing more he could do now. He had no control over the orca, no control over the sea. The only thing he had control over was how he would survive tomorrow. He closed his eyes, the exhaustion finally taking over, and for the first time in hours, he allowed himself to drift into a restless sleep. His mind was still filled with images of the orca, its sleek black body cutting through the water. But even then, as sleep claimed him, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. The orca wasn't finished with him. Not yet. The darkness outside the cave deepened, the wind howling, and Tom's last conscious thought was a single question. Would he survive the night? And then, everything went black.